I was walking through the vegetable garden this morning and something caught my eye. Thought initially it was a rose, because this little apple tree that we planted probably about 5 years ago is completely obscured from the other side and none of this fruit was showing. It's been swamped by the generous gardener rose that was planted more or less at the same time as the apple tree. So these fruits, which should have been harvested probably about a week and a half ago, really now need to come in because they're starting to be devoured by the birds and wasps. You can see them just coming away from here, and before I pick these I'm going to get a pair of gloves on, because unfortunately by not spotting the correct harvesting time on these, a lot of them have been subject to this sort of damage. But there are a couple of good ones, including this one. It should make a very good eating apple. Discovery is one of the first to mature and ripen in our season, and gives these beautiful red dappled yellow fruits when mature and ripe, and it should eat very well. Oh, here we have one of those discoveries cut for you to see the form of these apples, and notice the pink discoloration or red colour that actually extends in on the flesh of these apples when they're ripe. You remember I showed you the outer aspect. Top tends to be the richest red colour, down to a yellow at the base, but you can see in the flesh you've got a lovely pink tinge to it, which is retained when you cook these, but these are usually intended for use just as a straight dessert or eating apple. So I'm going to try this one now, see what it's like. Well, that's really nice. Somebody else is after a bit as well, I suspect. It's crisp, it's really juicy. It's got an apple taste, but there's a bit of soft fruit in there as well, almost strawberry, maybe a touch of raspberry. Definitely a sort of full-on fruity flavour to it, which is really pleasant. Now, discoveries won't store for very long. If you're going to store these, then they need to be frozen or cooked as a puree or apple pie, and then preserved or frozen in that way. But in an apple store, these won't last more than a couple of weeks. So there's no good laying these down and expecting to come to a decent apple in February time. It's simply not going to happen. But well worth growing, and one of the nicest, sweetest English dessert apples that is easy to grow in this country. What I was actually coming out to harvest was some of these cooking apples. I suspect this variety is Jane's Grieve. Not entirely certain, because this tree was planted many years before we purchased this property. It forms, again, a large cooking apple that's fluffy when cooked, with a red blush skin, and it crops very well for us, this one here. Just look at the volume of fruit that we've got on the sunnier aspect of this apple tree. This is the one that we've got the Paul's Himalayan Musk rose running through, so there's a little bit of competition for light up the top half, but this is now starting to drop its fruit. Now, we've had a lot of windy weather here over the weekend, so a lot of this did come down in the storm. We try and keep on top of this, but we just can't manage it with the volume of apples that come down, and it's quite a bit of rot in there, so we do need to get these tidied up and away onto a bonfire or compost heap. So this one is an early maturing cooking apple again, ripe now at the beginning of September and ready for use. I particularly like this one as a baked apple. We just core them, fill them with currants or raisins, a few nuts and some honey or syrup into the well, and then we just bake these for about 20-25 minutes until they're soft and fluffy, and they're absolutely delicious. I also need to harvest these pears now. This is a little culinary or cooking pear that we showed you earlier in the season. You can see that the skins now are starting to turn from a hard green to a slightly yellower tinged, soft, and the flesh on these is just ripening up now and really beautiful and sweet while still crunchy. But if they're left another week, then they're all going to end up as wasp food, and the amount of wasps these attract, I'm not going to get too close to this, but it's just insane. We're clearing these every day to try and reduce the risk to the dogs in the garden, but they're falling faster than we clear them up, and the wasps are just devouring them. So, time to try and harvest the best of this fruit, and There's plenty here for us and to give away to friends and family, just off this one tree. This is one of our older bramley trees, and earlier in the season I was quite concerned about this because it hadn't dropped any of the smaller fruit, and I was looking at what was on the tree thinking we're not going to get a decent bramley to store. The beauty of these fruits are that we'll pick these at the end of September, beginning of October, pick the best perfect fruit. Just look at that, lovely apples, and these change if they're put into storage. They'll go from this fresh, crisp, juicy, quite sharp apple to a beautiful, waxy, textured, soft and fluffy apple, and keep in our apple stores here, which are just very cold pantries, in apple boxes. We don't wrap these in paper or wax paper at all. They just sit slightly apart from one another on trays in the cold pantry where there's no heat but it's frost free. Right the way through. We had them this year in end of March, beginning of April. There were still some good ones. You've got to keep picking over them and remove any that start to brown off and rot. But this is a really good storing apple that will keep you in fresh apple right the way through the winter. What I'm not going to be harvesting any of this year in this garden is plums. These trees are really unhappy in this very dry orchard, and they really haven't put any fresh growth on for about the last 2 to 3 years. I know what the problem is. It's hardcore that they're planted into. This used to be an old tennis court, and it was compacted and used later as a driveway before the orchard was planted here. Now that makes for very difficult growing, and what I made the mistake of doing was not putting adequate holes in the ground when these were planted. You'll see the netting that we have to wrap around all of these to protect them from the rabbits and deer, otherwise the bark would be stripped every year. I've also failed to keep the grass from around the growing stems of these trees, and that's competing for the nutrients and water that is going into this soil. So not going to give up on these just yet. We're going to clear a good couple of feet around this apple tree of grass and give it a top dressing and a feed, and hopefully it will poke its way through the hardcore eventually and get going, and that will be easy to spot because the top canopy of this tree will just explode and get going. But so far, not happy. And the same problem on this Norfolk russet. Won't be at all surprised if we lose this little tree. Planted by the previous owners, been in here almost 8 to 9 years, maybe longer, and again just not got its roots down. We have had fruit off this in previous years, but it's just browning up its leaves to try and conserve the little water that it's getting through. And there's quite a bit of dieback on this tree. So not everything in this garden is a great success this year, and increasingly we're finding that in these dry conditions we're struggling to establish some of these fruit trees. This little apple tree, which again I think is a bramley seedling, demonstrates the problem I mentioned earlier in terms of them failing to have a June drop and just carrying loads and loads of tiny little deformed apples. There's a few good ones on here, but you've got to look hard for them. Let's go around the other side, see what we can see. Yeah, around here just a couple of decent sized apples, and they're probably going to be the ones that the wasps head for first. You can already see them burrowing into those top two. It's almost inevitable that your best fruit are going to be the ones that when you come to actually pick them are going to have hollowed out centres and be full of wasps. But that again, characteristic of the problems we've been having here this year with the hard fruit. That's why the harvest is going to be down quite a bit this year. But I think we're going to have sufficient decent apples off that first tree I showed you to carry us through into the spring with fresh apple. We've just come round into the vegetable garden and the divide between that and the lawn garden at the back of the vegetables, and we've just spotted this little pear tree which was almost demolished when the Ethel Rose supports collapsed and we had to deal with that. We've almost got those back in place now. We're going to rewire that and restring Ethel up on some of those new growths that are coming, as you can see there. But just look what we managed to miss. An absolutely single but beautiful truss of lovely firm Concord pears. I've got my hand in there just for scale. These are looking very healthy, very nice. They're still rock hard. These aren't going to ripen up probably for another couple of weeks yet, but I'm going to keep a very close eye on those and try and keep the birds off them so that I get to eat those three, because they're quite precious due to the scarcity of the crop that we're going to have off this little tree. But this one is growing. Of all my pear trees that have gone in over the last couple of years, this one was growing nicely and still looking quite healthy. I think that's going to survive, and we'll tie that back in and it will hopefully grow away this next season. This little apple tree is another one of our failures this year. It's normally absolutely covered in, by this time of year, what are bright red, quite smallish but sweet eating apple again. Again, it's been here since before we purchased the property, so we don't exactly know the variety. Got a feeling it might be John Gold. It has got a single fruit on it, which is a rather disappointing looking thing, which the birds have been at. It's characteristically slightly oval in shape, this apple. As I say, this one isn't as fully red as they normally are. It's usually absolutely rich crimson red, the whole skin, top to bottom on these things. I think this one's suffering, and the only reason it's surviving is that it's in a shady little covered area of this tree. But again, I'm hoping next year this is going to come back. Don't see any reason why it shouldn't, other than again it's being a little bit thugged by the combination of roses that are planted through it. But it's breaking away through the top and should be putting on some good strength this year. So hopefully next year we'll have a beautiful display in autumn. Fruits are almost as good to look at as they are to eat on this one, so we'll see how that one goes. Next to it is this other little eating apple, unknown variety again. There's one of the fruits. If anybody can help me out with identifying what this might be. It's not a large apple. It's carrying a lot of crab apple sized fruit again this year, as a lot of these trees have. But again, nice sweet mid-season maturing apple. Usually starts dropping around late September. Not much left on the tree into October. And again, a nice sweet crisp yellow fleshed apple. There's no colour into the flesh on this one when we eat this. I'm probably going to get a good couple of dozen off that if these continue with the wet that we've had to increase in size to a decent level. But at the moment they're still pretty tiny if they come in. Yeah, small. That's one of the better ones there, but still on the small side. Probably would have benefited from a pick over and thinning out, but then I usually rely on the natural June drop to do that for me, which this year just failed to occur.